Hi, and welcome to the Horizon Call Center training. What we're going to run through in this session is the setup of the Horizon Call Center, and then we're also going to have a second session which will run through how the users interact with the call center software, looking at the supervisor system, and also some breakouts to the Akixi options that are available on the platform as well. So going straight into the Gamma portal, if we go into Provisioning and Service Management as usual, Hosted, Horizon, and then Horizon Manage Company, locate your account, and then if we first of all go into Manage Subscriptions, what we'll have here is a list of the subscriptions that are available with regards to the call center functionality. And note that there's 3 bolt-ons, so these are chargeable functions. The call center agent, each user who is a member of the call center has to have a call center agent bolt-on. Please note though that means that you can be an agent of multiple call centers and you just need that one bolt-on per user. You then have the call center agent client, which we'll go through in the second of these sessions, and also the call center supervisor client. Again, we'll go through that in the second session. There is a further subscription, which is the additional configuration option, and this is the call center group. So each call center that you actually configure needs to have a call center group subscription. Say for instance you have one call thread for the primary number moving into the customer's Horizon system, that will have the call center group option. Each of the users that sits underneath that call center will have the call center agent subscription. Then you have 2 discretionary options with the supervisor client and the agent client, and as I mentioned before, you may decide that you actually want to use the Akixi system rather than the Horizon system in that instance. So going into the Horizon system now, and we're going to log in to Horizon. There's a number of sections within the Horizon system that we need to identify and show you where these settings are going to be. So the first one is within the users. So if we go to the user list and then edit one of the users, within services you can see here that we have the different options for call center agent, call center supervisor client, and agent client. So again, as I said before, you need to have the agent client if this member of staff is going to be part of that call center, but the agent client and the supervisor client are discretionary, whether you're going to be on the Horizon setup or the Akixi setup for the management of the calls. The second section is within administration, and then we have 2 options here, agent default settings and agent unavailable settings. If we start off with agent default settings, we have an option here for a guard timer, and the guard timer gives you up to 25 seconds to be able to work in almost offline work or after call work to enable you to just add some notes as a user before the next call comes in. There is an additional way that we can use that with the after call work function, so I'll show you that later on as well, and it probably means that you won't use that setting, you'll use the after call work instead, but I'll explain that again in a few minutes. Use agent unavailable settings allows you to force the agent to put themselves in an unavailable state after a certain number of bounced calls. So let's say for instance one of your members of staff forgets to put themselves in a busy state, and then they go away from the desk. Maybe they go to make a brew or pop to speak to a colleague or similar. When you see a bounced call on the system, it will allow you to then move them into a busy state, and that way they're not going to receive any further calls until they get back to the desk and put themselves back into an unavailable state. The second option on here is agent unavailable codes. This bottom section here is where you can add agent unavailable codes. So, for instance, we have things like lunch, break, training. You can add additional ones from here. To have them live straight away, you click on active, pop in a code number, and then the description for that code. whatever that might be. Click save. So as you can see, that one already exists, so I'll give it a random number, and then that will appear in the list. Now I have used 25 for this, but I would recommend that you only use options 1, 2, 3, etc. Just purely because the agents are going to need to remember which of those options they move into when they're using these functions. The second section here is the Enable Agent Unavailable codes. And by ticking this option, you have the ability to set 3 different functions. The first one is to set a default code on Do Not Disturb activation. As you can see here, option 9 I've created as Do Not Disturb. So if I set this to option 9, what will happen is that each time one of the agents puts themselves into a Do Not Disturb status, they will automatically be changed from Do Not Disturb into an Agent Unavailable 9 code. And that means when you're looking at your reporting on a KIXI, you'll be able to see that certain agents are putting themselves in Do Not Disturb, and therefore you can ask them to change that way of working and ensure that they're actually using the correct codes like lunch, break, etc., rather than using the Do Not Disturb function. Equally, that option on the previous page with regards to consecutive bounces, you can set one of these options as that as well. And then the final option on there is force use of agent unavailable codes with a default code. So say for instance I want to use option 8, I've got it down as test at the moment. Maybe I want to set this for the unavailable codes. So what will happen is if an agent puts themselves in a busy status but doesn't state why they're busy, then they'll go into this default status of busy 8. And that way again you can then look at the agents that are actually doing that and ensure that they're then making the changes on their system correctly, rather than just using busy rather than busy 1, busy 2, etc. The next section, which is where we'll spend the rest of this session, is looking at the actual configuration of the call center functionality within call groups. So I'm going to click on Add to create a new call center, and as per usual with Horizon, you'll have to allocate a site, you'll have to give it a name, and you'll also have to give it a username as well. Click on Continue, and the first page with the options on is going to be looking very similar to the way that the hunt groups or call queue groups actually work in the other call group functions. So the first section is ring order, and you can specify what type of ring order your customer requires. You then have queue length. Now by default on a call queue group, the maximum number of people in a queue you can have is 25. With call center, however, that can be as many as 50. And then depending on how you want this to work, you can play a ringing tone when offering the call to the agent, and also you can reset the caller statistics upon entry into the queue. So again, depending on how you want that reporting to work, will decide on whether or not you tick either of those boxes. Within the agent settings section, you have allow agents to join call centers. Now, what this will allow you to do is allow the agents themselves to set whether they're in one of the call center groups or not. So if you don't want them to have that access, because usually a supervisor would have that access rather than an agent, then leave that one unticked. And also allow call waiting on agents. Now again, I'd recommend that you don't have call waiting on agents. The reason being, say you've got one user with call waiting set up on their system. If a second call comes in, then that might be delivered to their device, to their second line, in which case it means that even though they might be on a longer call than one of their colleagues, that call is already sat on that agent's handset waiting to be delivered, and therefore the incoming caller will not get answered as quickly as they may do. You've also got enable maximum ACD wrap-up time. So this is what I was saying with regards to using the guard timer. You can enable, instead of using guard timer, you can use wrap-up timer, and this means that you can set it per call center rather than as a default for the the whole of the customer account. So again, it might be you've got a system where the customer has a support call group where people are dealing with faults, and it also may be that they've got a second call center that goes through for general questions. Now, there's probably not an awful lot of work needed for wrapping up a call based on general questions, but there definitely would be for a fault type scenario, in which case then you just need to make sure that the timers will be set correctly for those agents. So for example, on this instance, I'll say that you get 60 seconds wrap up time. And then you also automatically want to set the agent to a certain status after the call, which again I would expect would normally be wrap up unless you don't have any wrap up time, and then you'd perhaps want to put them in available. So click and continue, and from here you can now add users to the account. So I'm going to just add 4 users. And note that only the users with the call center subscription will be in this list for you to actually request or allocate from. Click on continue. And now we're looking at the supervisors. So I'm going to set 2 supervisors in this system. And continue once more. Now it may be that you have 2 supervisors, and the 2 supervisors want to see all 4 of those users. Or alternatively, you can group the users together and have one supervisor managing some, save that, and then have another supervisor managing the others. Again, it's very much down to how you want to set it up, how the customer actually wants that configuration. Hit continue again, and then this is where you'd allocate numbers. So at the moment there's no DDIs available on this account. This is a test account, but you will need to allocate an extension number as well. And then we're going to click finish and edit. So we've been through and set up the basic call center, but there's an awful lot of other information that you can set up within here as well once the call center has been created initially. So again, if we go to the settings tab, although we've got all those settings that I mentioned before, we've also got 3 additional tabs now. The overflow section gives you the ability to decide what happens if a 51st person tries to connect to the call center number. Well, you can play a busy tone. You may transfer them to another call flow. You know, it might be that you've got like an overflow call flow that you want to link them to. Or you can play ringing until the caller hangs up. Now that might seem like a strange thing to say, but you'll create an audio file which will say something along the lines of, "We're really sorry, none of our agents are available at the moment, we're under high call volumes, please call back later." And you may repeat that a few times, and then basically they'll be in a black hole until the user hangs up. You've also got enable overflow calls after the customers had to wait for a certain length of time. So you might decide, well actually 10 minutes in a call queue is too long, therefore what we'll do is we'll move those straight into this overflow process, and then either they can call back, they can leave a voicemail, you know, whatever process you've actually decided. And then finally, play the announcement before the overflow processes. So again, you would probably use that in conjunction with that play ringing until caller hangs up. So stranded calls are when something like the schedule changes. So let's say, for instance, you have a customer with a schedule at 5 o'clock, that schedule moves to a mobile, like an on-call mobile setup. And at 4:55, they're still in the queue. They're waiting until 5 o'clock because there's no agents available to answer the call. What happens to them after 5 o'clock? Because the way that Horizon works would be that the schedule actually stops working and will stop delivering the calls to those agents because they're due to finish at 5. So what you can do in that instance is either leave the call in the queue, you can play a busy tone, or you could transfer to another phone number. Again, one thing you could do is transfer it back into the same call queue, but then it's also then going to get the events based on the schedule that's happened after 5 o'clock, because they'll have reverted back to the 5:01 schedule, whatever that may be. And bounce calls gives you the ability to bounce the call after a certain number of rings. Now this is when your customer has maybe left the desk and the phone's just ringing out on their desk. How many rings is it going to take before you bounce that call back into the queue? Again, it's going to be specific to the way that you want or the customer wants to work. I would suggest probably 5 rings is about right, so it's around about 10-15 seconds to answer the call. If they're not available, bounce it back. Bounce calls if the agent becomes unavailable while routing the call is a useful feature as well. So if you imagine in your normal PBX world, what you have is you have the customer probably sat on the same site as the PBX, and it takes fractions of a second to deliver that call from the PBX to the user. So there's very limited chance that that user will actually walk away from their desk before they actually before the call is completed and moved onto their handset. Whereas with Horizon, because the PBX is in the cloud, it can take a few seconds, maybe 2 seconds, in which case there is the chance that they may walk away from the desk and put themselves in busy whilst that call is being delivered to them. So I would always tick that option as well. And then you have alert the agent if the call is on hold for longer than a certain length of time, so it will play a beep in the agent's ear. And also bounce calls after being on hold for a certain length of time, so it might be that you want to move them back into the queue if they've not been returned to after a certain length of time. Moving on to the next tab, the users looks exactly the same, so we won't touch anything there. Numbers is the same as well, so again we'll miss that. Announcements is completely new, so we'll spend a little bit of time here. First of all, you may want to enable an entrance message, and you also may want to make that a mandatory message. You know, it may well be they can't actually get delivered to an agent until that's been stated, so calls are being recorded for training purposes would be something that you'd want them to listen to, even if there's nobody in the queue before them. Estimated wait time. This gives you the ability to allow the user to know how long their expected wait is going to be. So the first one is to announce the queue position, you know, you're currently number 3 in the queue, etc. The second way is to announce a wait time. So it will actually give you an estimate based on your current timescales that the calls are taking to be answered. It will advise you, please hold, it will take around 5 minutes before we actually answer this call. The comfort message makes sense. You know, if you're in a long call queue, you probably want a few comfort messages saying we're really sorry, you know, your call's really important to us, please bear with us, we'll be with you as soon as possible. And music on hold, again, just something to the caller's interest as the calls go through. Call recording works the same way as all the call recording within Horizon. As it states here, because I haven't got a DDI allocated at the moment, I can't set call recording up, and that's the same throughout the Horizon system. Voicemail allows you to enable voicemail on this group, and note that once you actually enable voicemail here, there's an additional setting that appears in this page which allows the callers to dial a certain number to leave a voicemail. So as part of your announcements, we may state, we're really sorry that you're part of a long queue, we appreciate your custom, please bear with us, if you want to leave us a voicemail, hit 0 at any time and we'll take a message. You then have all the different personalizations on the voicemail as usual, and then finally the advanced section works exactly the same way as core queue groups and hunt groups do, in the fact you enable the virtual package and then you can set up a schedule as usual. So this brings this session to a close. In the second video we're going to talk about how the agents and supervisor clients work, as well as looking at the Akixi system, and then finally we'll start looking at some troubleshooting as well.